She left the Michelin-starred restaurant laughing, mocking the single dad with baby spit-up on his collar and a cheap dinosaur toy peeking out of his pocket. To Audrey, a ruthless billionaire CEO, he was a pathetic joke. She tossed a $100 bill at him and walked out, thinking she'd never see this loser again. But 3 days later, at an elite high society gala, her decorated military father locked eyes with the same single dad, froze, and snapped a trembling, tear-filled salute. Audrey Kensington did not do well with failure, and she absolutely abhorred wasting time. At 32, she was the sole CEO of Kensington Global, a logistics and tech empire based in the sprawling steel and glass skyline of Chicago. Her life was measured in fiscal quarters, hostile takeovers, and stock prices. Empathy was not a metric she tracked. Her father, General Wallace Kensington, a retired 4-star commander whose name commanded respect from the Pentagon to Capitol Hill, was the only person on Earth who could dictate her schedule. And tonight, he had mandated a blind date. "You are 32, Audrey," Wallace had barked through the phone earlier that afternoon, his voice still carrying the gravelly authority of a battlefield commander. "You run a billion-dollar company, but you run your personal life like a barren wasteland. Beatrice found a good man, grounded, responsible. You will meet him at 7, and you will not bring your Bluetooth earpiece." Audrey had scoffed, tapping her manicured nails against her mahogany desk. "A setup from Aunt Beatrice? What is he, a hedge fund manager with a trust fund and a golf handicap? Fine. 1 hour, Dad. That's all he gets." At exactly 6:55 p.m., Audrey stepped out of her chauffeured Maybach and into the gilded lobby of L'Orchidée, Chicago's most exclusive French restaurant. She wore a bespoke charcoal Tom Ford suit that screamed power, her stiletto heels clicking sharply against the Italian marble floors. The maitre d' practically tripped over himself to usher her to the best table in the house, a secluded booth overlooking the sparkling city lights. She ordered a $200 glass of Pinot Noir, placed her gold Rolex face up on the table, and waited. 7 o'clock came and went. Then 7:10. By 7:15, Audrey's jaw was locked in a tight, furious line. She was mentally calculating the thousands of dollars she was losing by sitting here. She reached for her phone to call her driver when a sudden commotion at the front entrance caught her eye. A man was arguing quietly with the maitre d'. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and entirely out of place. Audrey narrowed her icy blue eyes. The man was wearing a faded navy blazer that had clearly seen better decades. Underneath it was a light blue button-down shirt that was completely untucked on one side. But what caught Audrey's attention was the massive, crusty white stain smeared across his left shoulder. He looked like he had been dragged behind a minivan through a suburban driveway. His dark hair was disheveled, falling over his forehead in a chaotic mess, and his hands, large and heavily calloused, were frantically searching his pockets. To her absolute horror, the maitre d' pointed a white-gloved finger directly at her table. The man sighed, wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, and began walking toward her. Audrey felt a visceral wave of disgust. This was the man Beatrice had set her up with. "Audrey?" he asked, his voice unexpectedly deep, carrying a quiet, raspy exhaustion. He stopped at the edge of the table, offering a tentative, apologetic smile. "I'm Calvin Miller. I am so incredibly sorry I'm late." Audrey didn't stand. She didn't offer her hand. She simply stared at the crusty stain on his shoulder, then let her gaze travel slowly down to his scuffed leather boots, and finally back up to his tired brown eyes. "You're bleeding," she stated coldly. Calvin blinked, looking down at his hands. A fresh scrape across his knuckles was indeed welling with a small drop of blood. "Oh, right. Slipped on a plastic triceratops on my way out the door, which, incidentally, is also in my pocket." He reached into his blazer and awkwardly pulled out a bright green plastic dinosaur, setting it on the pristine white tablecloth next to Audrey's crystal wine glass. Audrey stared at the toy as if it were a live grenade. "Sit down, Calvin," she commanded, her voice dropping 20 degrees. "Before the staff assumes you've wandered in off the street to ask for spare change." Calvin's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a brief shadow passing over his eyes, but he quickly recovered, sliding into the booth opposite her. He tried to brush off the stain on his shoulder, only managing to smear it further into the fabric. "It's a formula," he explained, noticing her disgusted glare. "My daughter Emma. She's 4, but she's helping me foster a newborn we took in last week. The baby had a spectacular reaction to her dinner just as I was walking out the door. The sitter was overwhelmed, so I had to stay and clean it up. I'm really sorry." Audrey took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine. "You are a single father." "I am," Calvin said, sitting up a little straighter. "And you foster infants?" "When I can, yes." Audrey let out a harsh, incredulous breath. "Beatrice has officially lost her mind. Tell me, Calvin, what is it that you do for a living that affords you the luxury of arriving 20 minutes late to a Michelin-starred restaurant smelling like sour milk?" "I'm a mechanic," Calvin said simply, meeting her piercing gaze without flinching. "I run a small auto repair shop down in South Loop, mostly older cars, a few restorations." Audrey stared at him. A mechanic, a single father, a man who carried cheap plastic dinosaurs into elite dining establishments. He wasn't a CEO. He wasn't a politician. He was a blue-collar worker with dirt permanently embedded in his cuticles. The utter absurdity of the situation bubbled up inside her. Her father, the great General Wallace Kensington, who demanded excellence and prestige in every facet of life, had allowed his eccentric sister to set Audrey up with a glorified grease monkey. "A mechanic," Audrey repeated, a cruel, razor-sharp smile slowly spreading across her flawless face. "This has to be a hidden camera show. Where are they, Calvin? Is my father watching this from a monitor in the back?" Calvin frowned, his calm demeanor shifting slightly. "I assure you, nobody is filming us. Your aunt came into my shop a few weeks ago because her Mercedes broke down. I fixed it. We got to talking. She said her niece worked too hard and needed to meet someone grounded. She asked if I was single. I said yes. That's the entire conspiracy." Audrey's laugh was sharp and devoid of warmth. "Grounded. Right, because nothing says grounded quite like showing up to a 5-star restaurant looking like you just wrestled a toddler in a dumpster." The waiter approached, holding 2 leather-bound menus, his eyes darting nervously between Audrey's icy glare and Calvin's stained shirt. "Water for him," Audrey snapped before Calvin could even open his mouth. "And the check for the table, now!" The waiter nodded hastily and vanished. Calvin leaned back in his chair, folding his large hands on the table. He didn't look angry, which irritated Audrey even more. He just looked deeply, profoundly tired. "You don't have to do that," Calvin said quietly. "I'm happy to pay for my own water, and if you'd like, I can leave." "I know I don't fit the dress code here, Audrey. It was a chaotic evening, and I didn't want to stand you up. I thought showing up late was better than not showing up at all. Clearly, I misjudged." "You misjudged everything," Audrey sneered, leaning forward, the ambient lighting catching the ruthless edge in her eyes. "Let's get something straight, Calvin. My time is worth roughly $4,000 an hour. By sitting here for 20 minutes waiting for you to wipe baby vomit off your clearance rack blazer, you have essentially robbed me of over $1,000. I don't do chaotic evenings. I don't do excuses. And I certainly don't do charity cases." Calvin's jaw tightened. The easygoing, apologetic father vanished, replaced by a momentary flash of something hard and unyielding in his dark eyes. It was a look that didn't match a simple auto mechanic, a look that made Audrey's breath catch for a microscopic second before she brushed it off. "I'm not a charity case," Calvin said, his voice dropping to a low, steady timbre. "I work 60 hours a week to provide for my daughter and the kids I take in. I own my shop, I pay my taxes, I don't measure my worth by how much I make an hour, Audrey. I measure it by who I show up for. How poetic, Audrey mocked, rolling her eyes. Save it for a greeting card. Do you have any idea who I am? I know you're the CEO of a logistics firm, Calvin replied. I am the CEO of Kensington Global. I move billions of dollars of freight across oceans. I negotiate with foreign governments. I employ 40,000 people. I am at the absolute apex of my industry. She gestured vaguely at him with her wine glass. And you fix carburetors and play with plastic triceratops. What could we possibly have in common? Nothing, apparently, Calvin said, shaking his head. He picked up the green plastic dinosaur and slipped it back into his pocket. Your aunt told me you were fiercely intelligent and incredibly driven. She failed to mention you were completely devoid of basic human decency. Audrey let out a loud, mocking laugh that echoed through the quiet, refined dining room. Several patrons at nearby tables turned their heads, their diamond earrings catching the light as they whispered among themselves. Basic human decency? Audrey scoffed, her voice dripping with venom. Decency is for people who can't afford to be honest, and honestly, Calvin, you are a joke. You're a struggling mechanic playing house with a kid you barely have time for, walking into a room you don't belong in, pretending you have a shred of dignity left. Calvin didn't yell. He didn't flip the table. He just looked at her. It wasn't a look of anger anymore. It was profound pity. And to Audrey, that was infinitely worse than rage. The waiter scurried back, placing a leather checkbook on the table. Audrey didn't even look at the total. She opened her pristine white Birkin bag, pulled out a crisp $100 bill, and threw it onto the table. It landed right in front of Calvin. Here, Audrey said, standing up and buttoning her suit jacket. Take this. Buy yourself a new shirt. Maybe get your kid a toy that doesn't come from a dollar bin. Consider it a donation. Calvin looked at the $100 bill. He didn't touch it. Slowly, he stood up. Despite his worn clothes and the stain on his shoulder, he towered over her, carrying a physical presence that momentarily suffocated the space between them. Keep your money, Audrey, Calvin said softly. You clearly need it more than I do. It's all you have. Audrey let out another harsh laugh, loud enough to make the maitre d' wince. Walk home, mechanic. She turned on her heel and strode out of the restaurant, her head held high, leaving Calvin standing alone in the center of the opulent dining room, surrounded by the whispers and stares of Chicago's elite. She felt a surge of adrenaline, a victorious rush. She had crushed a nuisance, eliminated a distraction, and reclaimed her evening. As her driver pulled the Maybach away from the curb, Audrey didn't spare a single backward glance. Calvin Miller was a stain on her week, easily wiped away and instantly forgotten. Or so she thought. 1 week later, the grand ballroom of the Palmer House Hilton was transformed into a glittering sea of crystal chandeliers, cascading white orchids and velvet draping. It was the night of the Kensington Foundation's annual charity gala, an exclusive black tie event dedicated to raising funds for severely wounded military veterans. For Audrey, tonight was business. It was a chance to network with senators, secure government defense contracts, and project the image of corporate philanthropy. She stood at the center of the room, draped in a backless emerald green Givenchy gown, a diamond choker glittering at her throat. She held a flute of Dom Perignon, flawlessly executing her role as the charming, untouchable hostess. Her father, General Wallace Kensington, stood a few feet away. Even in a tailored tuxedo, Wallace looked like he was ready to step onto a battlefield. He was a towering man with silver hair and a chest full of invisible medals, commanding the attention of everyone in his orbit. Politicians practically bowed when they spoke to him. Excellent turnout, Audrey, Wallace said, his gravelly voice cutting through the soft string quartet playing in the background. I see the mayor made it. I told him his campaign contributions would dry up if he didn't, Audrey replied smoothly, taking a sip of champagne. I expect we'll cross the $5 million mark in donations before dessert is served. Wallace nodded, though his eyes scanned the room with the perpetual vigilance of a soldier. "And what about your personal life? Beatrice tells me you walked out on the young man she set you up with last week. Left him sitting at the table?" Audrey rolled her eyes, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Please, Dad. The man was a grease-stained mechanic who showed up smelling like baby vomit. He was a loser. I merely corrected Beatrice's massive lapse in judgment. I don't have time to coddle the working class." Wallace frowned, a look of deep disappointment crossing his weathered face. "A man is not defined by the dirt on his hands, Audrey. He is defined by the weight he is willing to carry. You would do well to learn the difference." Before Audrey could fire back a sharp retort, her gaze drifted past her father's shoulder and locked onto a figure standing near the grand entrance doors. Her breath hitched. Her grip on her champagne flute tightened so severely her knuckles turned white. It was him, Calvin Miller. Audrey's mind raced. What the hell was he doing here? The tickets for this gala were $10,000 a plate. He was standing off to the side, near a marble pillar, speaking quietly to a man in a wheelchair. Calvin wasn't wearing his stained blazer tonight. He wore a black tuxedo, but to Audrey's critical eye, it was glaringly obvious that it was a cheap rental. The shoulders were slightly too broad, the sleeves a fraction of an inch too short. His hair was neatly combed, and he looked clean, but he still radiated that rugged, out-of-place aura amidst the sea of billionaires and socialites. Fury ignited in Audrey's chest. He followed me. The thought flashed through her mind like lightning. The pathetic, bruised male ego. She had humiliated him, and now he was stalking her at her own family's charity event, probably hoping to cause a scene or beg for a handout. "Excuse me for a moment, Dad," Audrey said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "There is an interloper I need to have forcibly removed by security." Without waiting for a response, Audrey marched across the ballroom floor. The crowd parted for her, sensing the sheer wrath radiating from her emerald-clad figure. She reached Calvin just as the man in the wheelchair wheeled himself away towards the bar. Calvin turned, and his dark eyes widened slightly in surprise as he saw Audrey bearing down on him like a missile. "Are you insane?" Audrey hissed, her voice vibrating with venom, though she kept it low enough to avoid a public scene. "How did you get in here? Did you sneak through the kitchen?" Calvin let out a slow, exhausted sigh. He didn't look intimidated. He just looked annoyed. "Audrey, hello. I didn't know this was your event. I should have guessed, given the name on the banner, but—" "Cut the innocent act," Audrey snapped, stepping closer, jabbing a perfectly manicured finger into the cheap fabric of his rented tuxedo chest. "You're obsessed. You felt humiliated because I put you in your place last week, so you tracked me down. Listen to me very carefully, mechanic. You are breathing air you cannot afford. I will give you exactly 30 seconds to walk out those doors before I have my security team drag you out by your cheap collar." Calvin looked down at her finger on his chest, then back up to her furious eyes. "I was invited, Audrey. I'm here to support a friend." "Invited by who? The janitorial staff?" Audrey sneered, her voice rising slightly. "You don't belong here, Calvin. Look at yourself. You're wearing a rented suit. You're a grease monkey playing dress-up in a room full of titans. Leave. Now." "Is there a problem here, Audrey?" The deep, booming voice of General Wallace Kensington echoed behind her. Audrey turned, a triumphant smirk on her face. "No problem, Dad," Audrey said, stepping aside so her father could see Calvin. "Just a pathetic stalker who slipped past the door staff. I was just having him removed." General Wallace stepped forward, his cold, authoritative gaze sweeping over Calvin's rented tuxedo. Audrey waited for the inevitable explosion. She waited for her father to summon the guards and toss Calvin into the street. But the explosion never came. Instead, General Wallace Kensington froze. The champagne glass in the general's hand suddenly trembled, the crystal clinking softly against his gold ring. Audrey frowned. "Dad, tell security to—" "Quiet!" Wallace choked out, his voice suddenly thick, entirely stripped of its usual commanding boom. Audrey stared in shock as all the color drained from her father's face. The great four-star general? a man who had stared down enemy combatants and ruthless politicians without blinking, was staring at Calvin Miller with wide, tear-filled eyes. The ballroom around them seemed to fall entirely silent. The string quartet faded into white noise. Slowly, Calvin Miller shifted his posture. The slouch of the tired mechanic vanished. He stood at perfect, rigid attention, his shoulders thrown back, his chin parallel to the floor, his eyes locking dead onto the general. And then, right in the middle of the glittering ballroom, under the light of $1 million chandelier, General Wallace Kensington brought his feet together with a sharp click. He raised his right hand, his fingers rigidly straight, and snapped a flawless, trembling salute to the mechanic in the cheap rented suit. "Captain Miller," General Wallace whispered, his voice cracking, a single tear escaping his weathered eye and tracking down his cheek. "My God, it's an honor to finally stand in your presence." Audrey's heart stopped. The world tilted on its axis. She looked at her father, whose arm was locked in the highest form of military respect. And then she looked at Calvin. Calvin Miller, the man she had mocked, the man she had thrown money at, the man she had called a joke. Calvin returned the salute with crisp, lethal precision. "General Kensington, sir," Calvin replied, his voice no longer the tired rasp of a mechanic, but carrying the quiet, devastating steel of a warrior. "It's good to see you, sir." Audrey stood paralyzed, her mouth slightly open, the emerald gown suddenly feeling like a lead weight around her chest. The mockery she had spewed just seconds ago echoed in her mind, sickening and deafening. What had she done? The silence in the grand ballroom was deafening. To Audrey, the glittering chandeliers seemed to dim, and the oxygen was suddenly sucked from the room. She stared at her father, General Wallace Kensington, a man made of iron and strict discipline, whose hand still trembled at his brow in a crisp salute. Slowly, Wallace lowered his hand. He stepped forward, closing the distance between himself and Calvin, and did something Audrey had never seen him do in her entire life. He pulled the younger man into a fierce, desperate embrace. "You vanished, son," Wallace said roughly, his voice choked with unfiltered emotion. He clapped Calvin on the back, the sound echoing through the quiet space. "After Walter Reed, after the medevac, you dropped off the grid. The Pentagon couldn't find you. I couldn't find you." "I didn't want to be found, General," Calvin replied softly, stepping back but maintaining a posture of deep respect. "I had a daughter to raise, and a promise to keep." Audrey's mind was spinning, violently trying to reconcile the grease-stained mechanic she had humiliated with the man standing before her, commanding the absolute reverence of a four-star general. "Dad," Audrey whispered, her voice barely audible. "Dad, what is going on? Who is this?" Wallace turned to his daughter, his eyes red-rimmed but blazing with a sudden fierce intensity. He looked from Audrey to Calvin, realizing the hostility that had been radiating between them moments prior. "Who is this?" Wallace repeated, his voice rising, carrying the unmistakable boom of a commander addressing his troops. He turned back to the crowd of politicians and billionaires who were watching the exchange with bated breath. "This," Wallace declared, gesturing to Calvin, "is Captain Calvin Miller of the 75th Ranger Regiment. 3 years ago, during a catastrophic ambush in the Helmand province, Captain Miller's unit was pinned down by overwhelming enemy fire. When the evacuation choppers couldn't land, Captain Miller held the line alone. He took 2 rounds to the chest and 1 to the shoulder. He dragged 4 of his men over 2 miles of hostile terrain to an extraction point. One of those men was First Lieutenant Ryan Brooks." Wallace's voice broke, tears freely spilling down his weathered cheeks. "Ryan Brooks, my godson, the boy I raised like my own after his father died. Calvin saved his life. He saved all their lives. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, but he refused to attend the ceremony. He left the military the moment he was discharged from the hospital." Audrey felt the blood drain from her face. Her stomach plummeted, hitting the floor with sickening force. He took 2 rounds to the chest. He dragged 4 men over 2 miles. Her mind flashed back to the restaurant, to the faded navy blazer, to her cruel, cutting words. "You are a joke. You're a struggling mechanic playing house, pretending you have a shred of dignity left." "Calvin," Wallace said, his voice softening as he looked back at the younger man. "You're in a rented tuxedo, at a charity gala for wounded veterans. Tell me why you're here." Calvin's gaze flickered to Audrey for a fraction of a second. A look completely devoid of anger, holding only that same quiet pity. Then he looked at the general. "One of the men I pulled out of that valley was Sergeant Tyler Hayes," Calvin said, his voice steady but heavy with an unspoken grief. "Tyler made it home, sir, but he passed away 2 weeks ago. Surgical complications from the shrapnel he took that day." Wallace closed his eyes, a look of profound sorrow crossing his face. "I am so deeply sorry, Captain. Tyler left behind a wife, Sarah, who is currently in a psychiatric facility dealing with severe grief," Calvin continued, his hands folding neatly in front of him. "And he left behind a 3-week-old baby boy. I'm fostering the boy until Sarah is well enough to take him back. I came here tonight because Tyler's name is on the memorial wall in the lobby. I wanted to see it. I didn't come to intrude, General." Audrey couldn't breathe. The crusty white stain on Calvin's shirt at the restaurant. "It's formula. My daughter, Emma, is helping me foster a newborn we took in last week." She had mocked him for smelling like sour milk. She had berated him for being 20 minutes late because he was desperately trying to clean up after the orphaned child of his fallen brother-in-arms. She had thrown a $100 bill at a man who had sacrificed his body, his career, and his anonymity to keep a broken family together. "You didn't intrude, son," Wallace said firmly, placing a hand on Calvin's shoulder. "You belong at the head table. Come with me. The mayor needs to meet you." "With all due respect, sir," Calvin gently stepped back. "I'm going to head home. The sitter is waiting, and the baby wakes up every 2 hours. I just came to pay my respects." Calvin gave Wallace one final crisp nod. Then he turned his gaze to Audrey. He didn't gloat. He didn't demand an apology. He didn't even look vindicated. "Have a good evening, Miss Kensington," Calvin said quietly. He turned and walked toward the grand exit, his rented tuxedo blending into the shadows, leaving Audrey standing in the center of the ballroom, surrounded by billions of dollars of wealth, feeling entirely, utterly worthless. "Audrey?" General Wallace Kensington's voice was no longer filled with sorrow. It was laced with a dangerous, icy fury. Audrey jumped, snapping out of her paralyzed state. The ballroom had slowly resumed its low hum of conversation, though many eyes were still darting toward her and her father. Wallace grabbed her elbow, his grip like a steel vice, and steered her out of the main hall, down a quiet, carpeted corridor, and into a private antechamber. He slammed the heavy oak door shut behind them. "Explain," Wallace demanded, his blue eyes piercing right through her. "How do you know Captain Miller? And why, when I approached, did you tell me you were having a stalker thrown out by security?" Audrey wrapped her arms around herself, suddenly freezing despite the heavy silk of her Givenchy gown. She had faced down ruthless corporate raiders and aggressive union bosses without blinking. But under her father's glare, she was a terrified child. "Dad, I didn't know," Audrey stammered, her voice shaking. "Didn't know what?" Wallace barked. He was the blind date," Audrey choked out, the admission tasting like ash in her mouth. "Aunt Beatrice set us up. We met last week at l'Orchidée." Wallace's face went completely blank. The realization washed over him in slow, horrific waves. He took a step back, looking at his daughter as if he were seeing a stranger. "Beatrice set you up with Calvin Miller," Wallace repeated, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. "And you walked out on him? You left him sitting at the table?" Tears sprang to Audrey's eyes, hot and humiliating. "He was late, Dad. He showed up wearing a stained jacket. He looked like a mess, and he told me he was an auto mechanic. I didn't know he was a war hero. I didn't know about the baby or the ambush or Ryan." "And that makes it acceptable?" Wallace roared, the sheer force of his voice rattling the framed artwork on the walls. Audrey flinched, shrinking back against the velvet wallpaper. "You thought he was a working-class single father, so you treated him like garbage," Wallace said, his tone dripping with absolute disgust. "You evaluated his worth based on the fabric of his coat and the title on his business card. You measure people like they are lines on a spreadsheet, Audrey. You think your wealth makes you superior." "That's not true!" Audrey cried, though the hollow ring of her own voice betrayed her. "Isn't it?" Wallace countered, stepping closer. "Calvin Miller is 10 times the man you will ever be. He runs a failing mechanic shop in the South Loop because he funnels every spare dime he makes into an account to support the widows of the men he couldn't save. He lives in a cramped apartment above a garage, raising a little girl alone. And now he is up at all hours of the night feeding a newborn baby that isn't his. He does this without asking for a single ounce of recognition." Wallace shook his head, a look of profound disappointment settling into his features. It was a look that shattered Audrey's heart completely. "I taught you how to succeed in business, Audrey," Wallace said quietly, his anger giving way to a weary sadness. "But clearly I failed to teach you how to be a human being." Without another word, General Kensington turned and walked out of the room, leaving his daughter entirely alone. Audrey collapsed into a high-backed leather chair, burying her face in her hands. A sob tore from her throat, raw and agonizing. The defenses she had spent a decade building, the arrogance, the ruthless pragmatism, the cold efficiency, crumbled into dust. She spent the entire night wide awake in her penthouse apartment, staring at the ceiling. When the sun began to rise over Lake Michigan, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, Audrey made a decision. She walked into her home office, opened her secure laptop, and bypassed her corporate emails. She used her high-level clearance contacts to pull the unclassified after-action military reports on the Helmand Province ambush. She sat in silence for 2 hours, reading the clinical, sanitized military language that described a descent into hell. She read about the RPG fire that decimated the convoy. She read about Captain Miller refusing medical evacuation, tying a makeshift tourniquet around his own bleeding chest, and dragging his men through mud and gunfire. When she finished reading, Audrey closed the laptop. She picked up her phone and dialed her executive assistant. "Cancel the merger meetings today," Audrey said, her voice raspy but resolute. "Ms. Kensington?" her assistant gasped. "But the board, the acquisition." "Cancel everything," Audrey ordered. "I'm going out." Miller's Auto Repair was located at the dead end of an industrial street in the South Loop. It was a sprawling, cinder-block building with peeling gray paint and 3 massive garage bays. The air smelled heavily of exhaust, old coffee, and oxidized metal. Audrey parked her sleek black Maybach down the street, feeling painfully conspicuous. She had stripped away her armor. She wasn't wearing Tom Ford or Givenchy. She wore a simple white blouse, dark jeans, and flat boots. Her hair was pulled back into a simple ponytail. She felt exposed, vulnerable, and terrified. She walked slowly toward the open garage bays. The roar of an air compressor drowned out her footsteps. Inside the dimly lit garage, surrounded by tool chests and dismantled engines, she saw him. Calvin was bent over the open hood of a rusted 1968 Mustang. He was wearing a faded gray t-shirt stained with oil, his muscular arms covered in a light sheen of sweat and grease. A smudge of black grease crossed his cheek. He looked exhausted, yet perfectly in his element. In the corner of the garage, inside a small glass-walled office, Audrey saw a little girl with curly brown hair, Emma, coloring at a small desk. Next to her was a portable bassinet, gently rocking. Audrey swallowed the hard lump in her throat and stepped into the garage. "Calvin?" she called out, her voice barely carrying over the noise of the shop. Calvin paused. He wiped his hands on a greasy red rag, ducked out from under the hood, and turned around. When he saw her standing there, he didn't look surprised, nor did he look angry. He just looked incredibly weary. "Audrey," he said flatly, tossing the rag onto a workbench. "If you're looking to get your Maybach detailed, you took a wrong turn. We only do under-the-hood repairs here." "I'm not here for a car," Audrey said, taking a hesitant step forward. Her eyes darted to the glass office, watching the little girl peek through the window before going back to her crayons. I came to apologize. Calvin crossed his arms over his broad chest. The fabric of his shirt pulled tight across his left shoulder, and for the first time, Audrey noticed the thick, jagged edges of a burn scar peeking out from beneath his collar, the remnants of the ambush. "You don't owe me an apology, Audrey," Calvin said, his voice calm. "We had a bad blind date. You didn't like me. You left. It's fine. You don't need to slum it down here in the South Loop to clear your conscience." "It's not fine," Audrey insisted, stepping closer, desperately wanting him to see the sincerity in her eyes. "What I said to you? How I treated you at that restaurant? It was vile. It was cruel. I judged you entirely on what I saw on the surface, and I was so wrong." Calvin sighed, looking up at the corrugated metal ceiling before bringing his heavy gaze back to her. "Look, you found out I was a soldier, and now you feel guilty. I get it. Your dad is General Kensington. The military is sacred to him, and by extension to you. But I'm not a captain anymore, Audrey. I'm just a guy trying to fix this Mustang before 5 o'clock so I can pay my property taxes." Audrey reached into her purse. Her hand trembled as she pulled out a pristine white envelope. "My dad told me what you do," Audrey said, her voice shaking slightly. "He told me that you funnel your shop's profits to the widows of your men. I have resources, Calvin. Kensington Global has a massive philanthropic arm. I want to help. I want to ease the burden." She held out the envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $1 million. To Audrey, it was a fraction of her net worth, but it was enough to keep this shop running for a decade. It was the only way she knew how to fix things. She was a CEO. She fixed problems with capital. Calvin looked at the white envelope suspended in the air between them. He didn't reach for it. Slowly, his jaw tightened. The calm, weary mechanic vanished, and for a terrifying second, the hardened ranger captain returned to his eyes. "Put it away, Audrey," Calvin warned, his voice dropping an octave, taking on a dangerous edge. "Please," Audrey pleaded, taking another step forward. "Just take it. It will help Sarah. It will help the baby. It will help Emma. You don't have to struggle." "I said put it away!" Calvin's voice cracked like a whip, echoing off the cinder block walls. Audrey jumped, startled by the sudden explosion of command. Her hand dropped, the envelope hovering by her side. Calvin took a deep, steadying breath, running a greasy hand through his dark hair. He stepped forward, closing the distance until he was standing just inches from her. The smell of motor oil and metallic sweat enveloped her. "You really don't get it, do you?" Calvin said, his voice low and intense. "You think you can just write a check and wipe the slate clean? You think you can buy redemption?" "I'm just trying to help," Audrey argued, tears finally spilling over her lashes. "I know I was awful to you. I'm trying to make it right." "You can't make it right with a piece of paper," Calvin said, his eyes locking onto hers, refusing to let her look away. "You threw money at me at the restaurant to make me go away. Now you're throwing money at me here to make your guilt go away. It's the exact same transaction, Audrey. You're just adding a few more zeros." Audrey froze. The truth of his words hit her like a physical blow to the chest. He was absolutely right. She was still treating him like a problem to be solved, a ledger to be balanced. "My men didn't die for a payout," Calvin continued softly, the anger bleeding out of his voice, leaving only a raw, open wound. "Sarah isn't locked in a psychiatric ward because she needs a check. She's there because her husband's heart stopped beating, and $1 million won't make it start again. I don't run this shop to get rich. I run it because fixing broken things keeps me grounded. It keeps me from losing my mind when I close my eyes at night and hear the gunfire." Calvin pointed a calloused, grease-stained finger at the glass office where Emma was gently rocking the baby's bassinet. "I show up for them," Calvin whispered. "I show up with dirty hands and stained shirts and tired eyes. That is what love is, Audrey. That is what value is. It's not money. It's the willingness to stand in the mud with the people who need you." Audrey stood paralyzed, tears streaming freely down her face, ruining her perfect makeup. The cashier's check slipped from her trembling fingers, fluttering to the dirty, oil-stained concrete floor between them. She looked at the check on the ground, then back up at Calvin's tired, beautiful face. The billionaire CEO, who commanded global fleets and thousands of employees, had absolutely nothing left to say. Calvin stepped back, picked up his red rag, and turned his back on her. "Go back to your penthouse, Audrey," Calvin said quietly over his shoulder, sliding back beneath the rusted hood of the Mustang. "I have work to do." Audrey stood in the echoing garage for a long time, the roar of the air compressor filling the silence. For the first time in her 32 years of life, she realized that all her wealth, all her power, and all her status meant absolutely nothing if she didn't know how to truly be human. Audrey Kensington did not sleep that night. She sat by the floor-to-ceiling windows of her Gold Coast penthouse, watching the city lights of Chicago blink against the dark expanse of Lake Michigan. For the first time in her life, the sprawling skyline did not look like a chessboard she controlled. It looked cold, sterile, and entirely empty. Calvin's words echoed in her mind, repeating like a relentless drumbeat. "You think you can buy redemption." That is what love is. It's the willingness to stand in the mud with the people who need you. By 6 a.m., Audrey had made a decision. She did not summon her chauffeur. She did not put on a tailored designer suit. Instead, she opened a neglected drawer in her massive walk-in closet and pulled out a pair of plain denim jeans, a simple gray t-shirt, and flat canvas sneakers. She tied her blonde hair back into a tight, utilitarian knot. At 7:30 a.m., the CEO of Kensington Global walked into a local hardware store and bought a pair of thick canvas coveralls and heavy-duty work gloves. By 8:15 a.m., she was stepping off the CTA Red Line train, navigating the cracked, weed-choked sidewalks of the South Loop. When Audrey walked into Miller's Auto Repair, the morning sun was just beginning to cut through the smog. Calvin was already under the lift, wrestling with the rusted exhaust pipe of an old Ford truck. Emma was sitting in her glass-enclosed corner, quietly eating a bowl of cereal while the baby monitor next to her hummed with the soft breathing of the newborn. Audrey walked over to the workbench, picked up a heavy push broom, and began to sweep the oil-stained concrete floor. The rhythmic scratch, scratch, scratch of the bristles over the concrete caught Calvin's attention. He rolled out from under the truck on his creeper, a heavy wrench in his hand, and froze. "What are you doing?" Calvin asked, wiping a smudge of motor oil from his forehead, his dark eyes narrowing in confusion. "Sweeping," Audrey said simply, not stopping her motions. "The perimeter of the shop is littered with metal shavings and old zip ties. It's a safety hazard for Emma." Calvin sat up, crossing his arms. "Audrey, I told you to go home. You can't just show up here and pretend to be a janitor. It's patronizing." Audrey stopped sweeping. She leaned against the wooden handle of the broom, meeting his guarded gaze with absolute, unflinching sincerity. "You told me I try to buy my way out of guilt," Audrey said, her voice steady. "You told me I don't know how to stand in the mud. You were right, Calvin, I don't. I have spent my entire life avoiding the mud. I pay people to keep my shoes clean, but I want to learn. I am not offering you a check. I am offering you my time. I'm free labor." Calvin stared at her, searching her face for any trace of mockery or corporate calculation. He found none. "I don't have time to babysit a billionaire who doesn't know the difference between a Phillips head and a flathead," Calvin muttered, though the harsh edge in his voice had softened slightly. "I am the CEO of a global logistics firm," Audrey countered smoothly, a faint, genuine smile touching her lips. "I oversee the maintenance schedules of a fleet of 3,000 freight trucks. I may not know how to rebuild a carburetor, but I know how to organize an inventory system. Look at your tool chests, Calvin. They're a disaster. You lose 20 minutes a day just looking for the right socket." Calvin glanced at his chaotic workbench, a faint flush of embarrassment coloring his neck. "Fine," Calvin sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "But if you complain about a broken nail, you're out." "Deal," Audrey said. For the next 2 weeks, Audrey Kensington lived a double life. From 8 a.m. to 1 p.m., she was in the boardroom, aggressively negotiating maritime shipping rates and tearing through financial audits. But at exactly 1:15 p.m., she would strip off her silk blouses, pull on her canvas coveralls, and take the train to the South Loop. She organized his entire parts inventory, color-coding the bins and digitizing his ordering system so he saved 20% on wholesale parts. She learned how to bleed brakes. She learned how to change oil without spilling it down her arm. But more importantly, she learned how to sit on the floor of the glass office and read The Very Hungry Caterpillar to Emma. She learned the exact angle to hold the bottle so little Leo wouldn't get the hiccups. She learned the terrifying, exhausting reality of Calvin's life, and she began to fall in love. Not with a hero on a pedestal, but with a man who was desperately, beautifully human. But reality, especially in the corporate world, rarely leaves people in peace. On a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Audrey was sitting at the shop's battered front desk, sorting through Calvin's mail. She opened an unmarked, thick manila envelope, expecting to find an invoice for an air compressor. Instead, her blood ran cold. It was a legal notice of eminent domain and aggressive property acquisition. The document stated that the entire industrial block was slated for immediate demolition to make way for a state-of-the-art autonomous shipping facility. Audrey flipped to the last page, her heart hammering against her ribs. The purchasing entity was Apex Logistics, a wholly owned subsidiary of Kensington Global. Her own company was trying to bulldoze Calvin's shop. Audrey stared at the acquisition notice, the heavy legal jargon blurring before her eyes. The signature at the bottom belonged to Jackson Pierce, her ruthlessly ambitious chief operating officer. He had initiated a hostile buyout of the South Loop district using a city zoning loophole, completely bypassing Audrey's desk because the acquisition fell just under the financial threshold that required direct CEO approval. I am the monster threatening his sanctuary. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling with fury, and dialed Pierce's direct line. Audrey, Pierce answered smoothly. To what do I owe the pleasure? You've been suspiciously absent from the executive floor the past few afternoons. Jackson, what the hell is the Apex South Loop Initiative? Audrey demanded, her voice a low, venomous hiss. You are authorized to optimize routing, not to bulldoze local businesses and evict private citizens. It's a strategic acquisition, Audrey, Pierce replied, his tone laced with patronizing calm. The South Loop block is decaying. We bought off the city council, and we're offering the tenants a fraction above market value. If they don't take it, we bury them in litigation until they default. It's standard procedure. Your father built this company on aggressive expansion. Don't go soft on me now. Cancel it, Audrey ordered. Withdraw the notices immediately. I can't do that, Pierce said coldly. The board has already seen the projections. If you try to kill this deal, I will call for a vote of no confidence. You'll be ousted by Friday. You're a CEO, Audrey, not a social worker. Act like it. The line went dead. Audrey sat frozen, the phone still pressed to her ear. She was trapped. If she killed the deal, Pierce would rally the board, fire her, and bulldoze the shop anyway. Before she could process her next move, a horrific, choking sound echoed from the glass office. Audrey's head snapped up. Calvin dropped his wrench, the heavy metal clattering against the concrete, and sprinted toward the office. Audrey was right behind him. Inside the bassinet, baby Leo was gasping for air. His tiny face was flushed a terrifying shade of purple, and his chest was retracting violently with every agonizing attempt to breathe. He's burning up, Calvin panicked, his large hands trembling as he gently scooped the infant into his arms. He was fine 20 minutes ago. Oh God, he's barely breathing. RSV, Audrey said, her mind flashing to the articles she had read about infant respiratory distress. We need to go, now. Calvin looked at his old, battered Ford truck parked outside. My truck's transmission is completely stripped. It won't make it past 2 blocks. We're taking my car, Audrey ordered, her corporate command voice returning instantly, cutting through the chaos. She grabbed Emma's hand and hoisted her onto her hip. "Calvin, get in the SUV, I'm driving." Audrey threw them into her practical, armored Volvo SUV, a recent purchase to replace the ostentatious Maybach, and slammed her foot on the accelerator. She navigated the slick, rain-soaked streets of Chicago with terrifying precision, running 2 red lights and swerving past traffic until they skidded into the emergency bay of Lurie Children's Hospital. The next 3 hours were a blur of sterile white lights, shouting nurses, and the terrifying hum of medical machinery. Leo was rushed into the Pediatric Intensive Care Unit, PICU, leaving Calvin, Audrey, and little Emma stranded in the cold, unforgiving waiting room. Calvin sat in a hard plastic chair, his elbows resting on his knees, his face buried in his grease-stained hands. He was shaking. The man who had faced down enemy fire in a foreign desert was completely broken by the fragile lungs of a newborn. Audrey sat next to him. She didn't offer empty platitudes. She didn't tell him everything would be all right, because she knew she couldn't guarantee it. Instead, she pulled a terrified, crying Emma onto her lap, wrapping her arms around the little girl and softly humming a lullaby to calm her down. Then, Audrey reached out her free hand and placed it firmly on Calvin's back, right over the jagged scar on his shoulder. She just held him, anchoring him to the present, sharing the crushing weight of his terror. Hours later, the double doors of the PICU swung open. Dr. Robert Weitzman, a senior pediatric pulmonologist, walked out, pulling off his surgical mask. Calvin shot up from his chair, his eyes wide and desperate. "He's stabilized," Dr. Weitzman said, offering a weary but reassuring smile. It was a severe respiratory syncytial virus infection, compounded by a slight pneumonia. "We had to intubate to open his airways, but his vitals are strong. He's a fighter, Mr. Miller. He's going to pull through." Calvin's knees buckled. He let out a ragged, tearing sob of relief, catching himself on the edge of a hospital chair. Audrey stood up, holding Emma, and for the first time, Calvin turned and pulled Audrey into a desperate, crushing embrace. He buried his face in her neck, his tears soaking into the collar of her canvas coveralls. "Thank you," Calvin whispered against her skin, his voice entirely broken. "You saved him, Audrey. If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't driven us..." Audrey closed her eyes, resting her cheek against his temple, her heart swelling with an emotion so profound it physically ached. But as she held him, the crumpled legal notice in her back pocket felt like a ticking bomb. She had saved his family today, but her company was poised to destroy his livelihood tomorrow. "Not if I burn it down first," Audrey thought, a ruthless, protective fire igniting in her blood. The following Monday, the boardroom of Kensington Global was an absolute war zone. Audrey stood at the head of the massive mahogany table, dressed not in coveralls, but in a razor-sharp midnight blue Tom Ford suit. The armor was back on, but this time, she wasn't fighting for profit. She was fighting for her soul. Jackson Pierce sat to her right, a smug, triumphant smile plastered across his face. He had already circulated the motion for a vote of no confidence. "Audrey," Pierce said, leaning back in his leather chair, "your sudden emotional attachment to the South Loop is a liability to our shareholders. We are a logistics empire, not a charity. We need that land for the Apex terminal." "No, Jackson, you don't," Audrey said, her voice echoing with absolute authority. She pressed a button on a remote, and the massive screen behind her illuminated. It didn't show the South Loop. It displayed a highly detailed, sprawling map of a massive, abandoned industrial rail yard just over the state line in Gary, Indiana. "This," Audrey declared, her eyes sweeping over the 12 board members, "is the Hammond-Gary Rail Corridor. It has direct access to the interstate, a pre-existing infrastructure that requires zero demolition, and it sits in an opportunity zone, which gives us a massive federal tax break." She handed out thick, meticulously researched dossiers to every board member. "I spent the entire weekend running the analytics," Audrey continued, leaning forward, placing both hands flat on the table. Jackson's South Loop plan costs us $80 million in aggressive buyouts, demolition, and inevitable PR nightmares when we forcibly evict veterans and small business owners. My plan costs $40 million, utilizes existing rail lines, and fast-tracks our timeline by 8 months. The board members began flipping through the dossiers. The numbers were undeniable. Pierce's smug smile vanished, replaced by a pale, panicked realization. You bypassed my department. I am the CEO, Jackson, Audrey said softly, a deadly edge to her voice. I don't bypass departments, I command them, and as of this moment, the South Loop acquisition is permanently terminated. Furthermore, you're fired. Clear out your desk by noon. The room sat in stunned silence. Audrey had just executed a flawless, bloodless corporate coup, securing the company's future while simultaneously protecting the community she had grown to love. 2 weeks later, the air in Miller's Auto Repair smelled of fresh coffee and rain. Little Leo was back in his bassinet, breathing easily, kicking his tiny legs. Sarah, Tyler's, had been transferred to an outpatient recovery program at Rush University Medical Center and was making incredible progress. She was scheduled to take Leo home in just a few days. Audrey was under the hood of a 1992 Jeep Cherokee, her face smudged with grease, wrestling with a stubborn serpentine belt. You're holding the tensioner pulley at the wrong angle. A gravelly, deeply familiar voice boomed through the garage. Audrey gasped, nearly dropping her wrench, and ducked out from under the hood. General Wallace Kensington was standing in the middle of the garage, dressed in a sharp civilian suit, holding 2 cups of coffee. He looked at his daughter, the Billionaire CEO, covered in motor oil and sweat, and a slow, incredibly proud smile spread across his weathered face. Dad, Audrey breathed, wiping her hands on a rag. What are you doing here? I came to bring my daughter a coffee, Wallace said, stepping forward and handing her a cup. He looked around the shop, noting the impeccably organized tool chests and the newly swept floors. And I came to see if the rumors were true. Word on the executive floor is that you gutted Jackson Pierce and redirected a $100 million logistics hub just to save a mechanic's shop. Audrey stood tall, meeting her father's gaze without an ounce of hesitation. I protected a vital asset, Dad, and I protected the people who matter. Wallace's eyes grew bright. He stepped forward and placed a hand on Audrey's shoulder, right over the heavy canvas of her coveralls. For years I was proud of the empire you built, Audrey, Wallace said softly, his voice thick with emotion. But today I am finally proud of the woman you have become. Just then, Calvin emerged from the back office, carrying a sleeping Emma on his shoulder. He stopped dead in his tracks when he saw the general. Immediately, Calvin shifted Emma slightly, his posture straightening, preparing to offer the respect due to a commanding officer. But Wallace held up a hand. No salutes today, Calvin. I'm just a father visiting his daughter's place of work. Wallace gave Calvin a deep, respectful nod. Take care of her, son. She's finally learned how to fight for the right things. With a final squeeze of Audrey's shoulder, the general turned and walked out of the garage, leaving Audrey and Calvin alone in the quiet hum of the afternoon. Calvin walked over, gently laying Emma down on a small cot in the corner, pulling a blanket over her. He turned back to Audrey, looking at her as if he were seeing her for the very first time. He had received the cancellation notice from Apex Logistics a week ago. He knew exactly what she had done, the war she had waged to protect his sanctuary without ever asking for a word of thanks. He closed the distance between them, stepping directly into her space. He reached out, his calloused thumb gently wiping a smudge of black grease from her cheek. You went to war for me, Calvin whispered, his dark eyes filled with a raw, overwhelming reverence. I told you, Audrey said softly, leaning into his touch, her heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. I learned how to stand in the mud. Calvin smiled. A genuine, breathtaking smile that reached all the way to his eyes, wiping away years of exhaustion and grief. He slid his hand to the back of her neck, his fingers tangling in her messy blonde hair, and pulled her in. When he kissed her, It wasn't the polished transactional affection of the corporate world. It was a kiss built on grit, sacrifice, and the profound, unbreakable bond of two people who had fought through their own darkness to find the light in each other. Audrey wrapped her arms around his waist, surrounded by the smell of oil, steel, and rain, realizing that she had walked out of that Michelin-starred restaurant thinking she had lost $100 in 20 minutes of her time. Instead, she had found the only thing in the world she couldn't buy. Did Audrey's transformation from a ruthless CEO to a woman who understands the true value of sacrifice move you? This story proves that true worth isn't measured by bank accounts or pristine clothes, but by the courage to stand in the mud for the people who need you most. If Calvin and Audrey's journey of humility, love, and redemption touched your heart, please like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder about what truly matters in life, and subscribe to our channel for more real, emotional, and unforgettable stories.